dreams, moral pluralism, different versions of the good under an authoritarian government. Now, I just got back from China, spending 4 months doing my field work just at the end of the year. So I just put this together very quickly. So I have no PowerPoint, no pictures, no bibliography, no literature review, no nothing except some words here. So, and now these words are such that almost every sentence could actually have a footnote to a page in my interview notes. So this is just what people told me, except for the last few paragraphs, which is my own take on this. So I started out talking with about a salon I attended in last month among the social workers in Shanghai, and they had a passionate discussion about what is social work, how should we define it. Now it struck me this was an odd thing to ask because some of these were really veterans. Social work had just really got re-established in Shanghai about 15 years ago, but some of them had been there from the very beginning, and the one who asked the question of what is social work had been one of the first ones. So I would have thought that after 15 years, they would know at least what social work is, but they didn't, and they had a very, very passionate discussion about this. And it's a kind of an event that's interesting now in Shanghai and other places in China, these salons, where people can kind of let their hair down and debate things in a very, very spirited kind of way. They had a similar kind of a salon or a meeting a few weeks before, they told me, that was basically organized by the basically the party committee of Shanghai, in which the party members were telling them what they were supposed to do. They said that was pretty dull. And but here, this was informal, them organizing themselves, and it was very passionate and very full of complicated ideas. Basically, was social work a matter of having a credential or working for a registered agency or utilizing scientific methods or having the proper values? Who should social workers serve? The poor and the weak, the rich who could afford to pay for their services, the government? Should we be serving communities or individuals? Should they have a critical spirit in search of social justice, or should they only promote social stability and harmonious society? The key to answering most of these questions, most seem to think, was a question of values, the jiazhiguan. But there's no consensus on the content of the values. And so I thought this and other parts of the research were a good window on some of the fundamental challenges facing China today. It's now very fashionable in China to talk about the need to develop values. There's supposed to be a value crisis. Now this discussion comes all the way from the top. A major theme in the official media over the past 2 years has been the need for new values, for more stabilized values. And this is just not my subjective impression. A person I know in Shanghai did a content analysis, in fact, of the People's Daily and so forth the last 2 years, and this indeed is objectively a major, major theme. This has replaced the previous dominant themes of the need for continued growth in economic and social stability, although it's obviously connected with that. The values are supposed to, the new values are supposed to be part of Xi Jinping's China dream of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. The values are supposed to lead people to place public interest above personal interest, to spur on constant self-improvement while embracing the world through virtue. These are supposedly different from American values. In a compendium of Xi Jinping's essays, at the end of it, there's this statement: whereas the American dream emphasizes individuals seeking personal enrichment and success, the Chinese dream is a collective undertaking that calls upon the Chinese people to make personal sacrifices to serve the greater good. And so this notion must be disseminated to all levels. There are posters on walls and billboards and even the subway throughout Shanghai and throughout China, extolling proper Chinese values. And these are depicted in these posters and so forth, mainly as a kind of combination of quote-unquote traditional values, usually depicted in terms of kind of, lately, these traditional kind of woodcut pictures depicting children giving loving service to their parents, the name of filial piety. The big emphasis is xiaoshun. So here we get the Confucian tradition. But then those are combined with pictures representing the kind of martial socialistic values of modern, socialist China, especially ones of Lei Feng and Lei Feng serving the people and so forth. So I asked, but these pronouncements from on high give everyone permission to talk about values. And most people I talk with, including social workers at that salon, agreed there was a crisis of values in China, which needed to be discussed. But they didn't use the same terms as the official propaganda. And indeed, when I talk to people, no one ever spontaneously mentioned the China dream or even Xi Jinping, unless I asked. And the content of the values which they sought was not the same as those emanating from the party central. For instance, I asked one social worker about how the spirit of Lei Feng was connected to the service done by social workers. And she basically sort of laughed at me. And she said, "Oh, you must be seeing these posters on the subway." And she said, Lei Feng's ideals are good. Of course, we have the ideal of service like he did, but our approach is different. And the poster is very interesting. In front of one big social work office that was part of the family planning department in Shanghai. In front of the main door, there's a huge poster about, Xingfu Jiaqing and so forth. And so I asked her, so you're trying to make, Xingfu Jiaqing, what is this about? And basically, it was kind of a surprise. She hadn't noticed this poster. I mean, this poster was in the front of the thing. So there's this blanketing of the city with posters and, stuff on the subway. And it's not 100% sure that it totally registers with a lot of people. It's kind of background noise. In the meantime, underneath it all, they're pursuing their own visions of what they understand is good and bad and right and wrong. So the people I interviewed for this project were mainly social workers. Social workers in Shanghai provide a very good perspective on the churning of social values in China in transition, I argue. They stand in the front line of social problems: broken families, fractured communities, alienated youth, isolated elderly. They stand between the grassroots of an anxious society and the demands of an authoritarian government. They try to affirm the dignity of professionalism over against the dynamic pressures of a competitive market economy and the restrictive imperatives of a state obsessed with maintaining social stability. While trying to heal troubled families, they confront doubts about whether they are meeting the expectations of their own families. They are not without values, but these are values embedded in the practices of the institutions that they are part of. But the values are often contradictory and pull them in different directions, and they find it difficult to articulate a comprehensive worldview that would enable them to reconcile the values. So this overall is a summary of my overall argument here. Now, consider the values represented by social work. As I said, social work was sort of resurrected with the help of a sociologist, actually, because most of the social work programs were part of sociology departments. In Shanghai, actually in 2003, they had the first major kind of cohort of them, and it then sort of exploded since then, especially after 2008, after the Sichuan earthquake. It got a big boost, and there are all these social work agencies. Then what's the approach of the social workers? The approach that they learn when they study about this, especially in Hong Kong and with teachers from Taiwan, to some degree studying in the United States and Germany and elsewhere. The approach could be illustrated by the story of one social worker who told me how she began her work with at-risk youth who dropped out of school and were beginning to get into illegal behavior, including drugs and other kinds of antisocial behavior. She said there are tens of thousands of such youth in Shanghai. The reasons are bad family relations, bad fortune, mingyun, and social prejudice. Their parents might be divorced, or teachers prejudice against them because they come from quote-unquote bad families. This leads them to antisocial behavior. It was not easy to get them to trust me. I was the only social worker in the community. I came from an upright family, had a good education myself. They saw me as different. They thought I was connected with the police, especially as my project was designated as preventing crime. I got to know them by looking at their hobbies, sports, painting, and so forth, and I helped them help other kids, for example, by helping them play basketball and stuff together. Such activities gradually gained my trust and helped transform some of their lives. Implicit in this account are many of the basic values that constitute the professional social worker's sense of ideal identity. The first principle is professional autonomy based on their training and expertise. Following that is a commitment to the autonomy of their clients. A key motto displayed in most of their offices is to help people help themselves. 助人自助. They do this by finding out what people really need, whether through sociological surveys or simply by being good listeners. And then they try to gain the trust of clients by demonstrating that they're really there to help. Our priority is to address clients' inner psychological needs rather than simply to change their outward behavior. Addressing such inner needs means respecting their clients' moral autonomy. For example, a social worker described to me how in 2010 they introduced sex education into high schools. The materials they used were initially imported from Hong Kong and initially seized by the customs because they were deemed pornographic. But in any case, they started these programs. In sex education classes, we don't tell them what's right or wrong. Nowadays, many young people, and she was referring to teenagers having sex, we tell them that sex is very normal. Why are you so anxious about it? We tell them about the stages of sex, having feelings, kissing, touching, and so forth. Tell them about possible consequences from going from one stage to another, but tell them the choice is yours. You can learn about the process of love, but the choice is yours. When someone makes poor choices, social work is willing to apportion some of the blame to outside forces, even those of authority. Social worker talked about a student who was extremely disruptive in class. He resisted the teacher, so the teacher had no face. The old method would have been to have him write a confession, a Gentile, and do a self-criticism. In no approach, we try to understand the source of the problem. It could also be the teacher's fault because he doesn't understand the students. He's too demanding. He looks down on them. So we try to see all sides of the story. So the vision you can come out of these kinds of stories is, the ideal vision at least, is that of an egalitarian society in which individuals give each other mutual respect and help one another in a non-judgmental way through open and honest communication. This general approach and these principles, however, often come into conflict with the forces of authority. The social worker who described this new way of handling unruly students says, we get strong pushback from this. We have to work within the system. We can't get outside. This causes us grief. The most salient conflict is that with the government, which supports the social workers. As several social workers put it, we are not government officials. We are different from them. We are not paternalistic. We're not fumuguan. But for the most part, their funding comes from paternalistic government officials who are mainly concerned with stability maintenance. In contrast to the ideals of the social workers, the government agents stress hierarchy, a top-down exercise of surveillance and control, and they want to complete their task, wanchang renwu, as quickly as efficiently as possible, which leads to a focus on external compliance rather than internal consent. Over and over, the social workers complain that the government does not understand their work, will not grant them professional autonomy, and undermines their efforts. One social worker who also worked with delinquent youth said that the government's approach, of course, was to get them to do self-confession and study Marxism, Leninism. That doesn't work, she said. Between the social work profession and the political system, therefore, there's a clash of values. Democratic, individualistic, a stress on open communication versus authoritarian government control. But the government has the upper hand. Many of the social workers' agencies have names like Happy Communities and Happy Families. But when I asked one prominent expert about what they do to make people happy, he said, look, what you have to know is this. The main job is not to make the people happy, the Lao Bai Xing, but to make the government happy. Okay? And so this gets right down to it. The values embedded in social work are also in conflict with the market economy. a social worker who quit a lucrative job in a marketing company says, in business world, it's more competitive. Every kind of job wants you to move forward, but how depends on your value system. In business, they don't care about your family, just work hard, it's all for the business, all for making money. And she felt that social worker at least was about some kind of service. But they're also, the conflict with the economy or the tension-filled interaction comes from the fact that in terms of the labor market, the social workers are at the losing end in many ways of a competitive labor market, because they got into the profession very often because they didn't score high enough in the Gaokao and so forth to get into a major that could provide them with better jobs and so forth. As they have low wages and they think low respect, et cetera, and they're trying to salvage a certain kind of professional dignity in spite of the fact that in terms of the competitive values of an economic job market, they're sort of losers. Social workers also are pulled between the demands of different institutions. They get a sense of dignity by developing themselves as professionals. They are proud they're not like the authoritarian paternalistic government, even though the public, though, doesn't see it that way. People don't trust the government, one says. When we knock on people's doors, they won't answer because they think we're officials. Nevertheless, to the uncomfortable degree, they are the government. As one social worker puts it, much social work is politicized rather than professionalized. Social worker funding is mainly dependent on the government, which in the past several years under the Xi Jinping is increasing restrictions on their autonomy. The latest development is, and even in the last year, in the last few months, in fact, is that every agency has to establish a party branch or party committee within the agency. And some of them find this very, very galling. They feel they're not being, respected by the state, they're not being trusted by the state, et cetera, et cetera. But that's so there's a sense of a tightening of everything. Some of the most heartfelt complaints come from having to spend too much time gathering data and filling out paperwork to meet government demands for stability maintenance, and so forth. And finally, the very identity of social workers as a profession that works according to different principles from government bureaucracy is now being eroded by a political deprofessionalization. In Shanghai, the government is increasingly certifying cadres in the city's residential committees, the Jiwei Hui, as social workers. They give them a certificate and say, now you're a social worker, you're not just a Jiwei Ganbu. And the social workers who are professionals feel that this, is an affront to their professional, training and all that kind of thing. From this point of view of the government, though, you're introducing certain kind of social work principles into the process of basically surveillance and control that the Jiwei does, because you're utilizing something more akin to soft power than the harder coercive power, because they do surveys to find out what the residents want, and they use these more soft, persuasive kind of tactics, et cetera. So there's a sort of social workization of government, but the government, taking away from that, from the professional social workers who feel they have a certain autonomy that distinguishes themselves from government to a certain degree. And then a final problem is a tension between the workers themselves and the government, and their families, I mean. So there's tension between the workers in the government, workers in the economy, workers in the family, precisely because so many of them have rather low wages. It's very common to hear them say that their parents are disappointed in them because they have such a low-pay, low-status profession. Part of the reason they say is fate. But their parents' disappointment sometimes causes them moral anguish. Old people are happy, says one, if their children have success, but they're not too successful, at least not in the economic terms that dominate conversations in Shanghai, and this can conflict with their wish or their self-representation to be filial. Another thing you get from the conversations with them, of course, is their observation of and knowledge of the kind of contradictions within society as a whole. They work with rebellious youth, rebellion which comes from breakdown of various aspects of the traditional family, so much for filiality. They work with isolated and lonely old people whose children don't come to visit them and don't feel respected by their children anymore. And they try to persuade the children to go at least pay a visit every once in a while and call them. They said the parents really appreciate that so much, even a little bit. but often the kids are just too stressed and too busy by the other kinds of things to be able to do even that. They work with eroded communities, which are basically been dislocated, et cetera. In a place like Shanghai, of course, there are many houses that have been torn down in various areas and people relocated to new places. The government actually been pretty generous in Shanghai, giving them pretty good economic payout for this. But a problem is that and government officials, some of them admitted this. They just thought in terms of money, give them enough money and they should be happy. But people have been moved away from their neighbors and relatives and so forth, and they find themselves in new situations that are hard to cope with, et cetera. And there's a sense of community which becomes very problematic for people, especially for older people, that the social workers try to address. And then they also are witness to and try to do something about stigmatized, disabled people, mentally disabled, people with physical disabilities and so forth, who have lots of trouble in a place like Shanghai. So they see these contradictions in the society, and some of them are, another problem they have is they're quite aware that some of the problems they try to solve on a more individual basis are really connected with larger kind of structural problems, fundamental problems of inequality, et cetera, but they themselves admit that there's nothing they can do about that. And so there's a sense of they know too much, and therefore a sense of kind of frustration, a sense of wanting to solve these problems, a sense of being in conflict with different kinds of institutions, but also a sense that they need to survive in their professions and to work somehow within the system. How to do this? Well, one of them put it to me, there are three main options: go outside, go inside, and disengage. Go outside. First of all, one way to go outside for social workers is not to get in the profession at all. But 80% of those who get a degree in like MSW don't go into social work because it doesn't pay well enough. They go to work for some enterprise and so forth, use their skills. Or potentially you could try to go abroad or something like that. Go inside is, of course, try to work within the system, and work within the system by various ways of cultivating guanxi and so forth. This usually involves making compromises. Usually involves cultivating personal relationship with government overseers and to a lesser degree corporate supporters. But preserving this kind of this space for action, professional, is a challenge. One person I knew who taught a lot of social workers, as well as was a social worker himself, went on and on at great length talking about his best social worker. He thought she was totally fantastic. And I said, why is she so good? And unfortunately, I wasn't able to interview her myself because the schedule problem. But she's so good, he says, because besides being competent, her heart is so pure. She doesn't get polluted by society, she said. She won't get into the gray areas that you encounter in doing this work. And why is this? This, the leader says, is because the social worker is a Christian who's deeply engaged with her local church community. He himself is not a Christian, but has great respect for her because she maintains this purity, which she gets by being part of this kind of community. So one way, and this points to another way to deal with the issue, is staying within but kind of disengaging, that is living in but not of the world. And basically having a kind of community that separates you in various ways so you can kind of stand apart even when you're within. And one way was I interviewed some people in these agencies that were Christian agencies actually, and a Buddhist one too, in which they had a kind of a more closed community in which they were doing their own kind of version of social work. But they seem to have a higher morale and less kind of inner conflict than the others that I talked to. So that's my overall picture of this world in tension. And how do people bridge the gap between these competing values embedded in different institutions? One way, and this is my final comment, people may not like this, is one of the main ways to deal with it is, I said, is to lie. So they do it all. The Christian thing was registered as a business. The Buddhist thing was like a temple. It's represented as a cultural organization. Everyone basically says they're doing something else. This is what Rob talked about this morning. And it's not really a lie because no one's fooled. But everyone is kind of creating these kind of fictions and so forth. There's enough fiction to kind of keep people on the same page until the government decides it doesn't want to be on the same page, and that's a different problem. So my bottom line is that the society, in terms of values, is not very integrated. A better integrated society might have more widely shared, coherent frameworks for discussing common meaning and value. China today is not, in these terms, a well-integrated society. It's a deeply unequal society undergoing rapid but uneven development, home to many different versions of the good life, united by fictitious lip service and held together by a certain kind of resignation in the face of a powerful state. So that's...